It's almost impossible for sewers and quilters to throw away even the smallest piece of fabric. Our grandmothers and great-grandmothers were no different. They made use of every available remnant, often tracing small half hexagons or hexagon shapes to create a scrap or even a charm quilt. Those small templates intrigue me, yet the dedication of time is overwhelming. Then the idea came, why not supersize the templates? This lap quilt features the time-honored tumbler template, now 10 inches in length, not the 4 inches, which is traditional, speedy to stitch and enjoy. Grandmother's one-patch quilts, that's what's coming up next on Sewing with Nancy.
Sewing with Nancy, TV's longest-airing sewing and quilting program with Nancy Zieman, is made possible by Baby Lock, a complete line of sewing, quilting, and embroidery machines and sergers. Baby Lock, for the love of sewing. Madeira, specializing in embroidery, quilting, and special effect threads, because creativity is never black and white. Koala Studios, fine sewing furniture custom built in America. Clover, makers of sewing, knitting, quilting, and embroidery products for over 25 years. Experience the Clover difference. Amazing designs and Class A needles.
Years ago, often people would make charm quilts using this simple shape, about 4 inches in length. They'd share fabrics, have fabric swaps, and make a scrap quilt using this simple shape that tumbles or can turn around, as you can see, alternate its size. This little small sample is made just with this one shape. That's why we're calling this Grandmother's One Patch, and both of the programs will have a single template size to create quilts. And here you can see, simple to put together. But I like to make things a little bit larger and make it a little bit easier, because initially, when this was worked on as a project, a template was used and people would trace along the sides and then cut out every which way possible that they would like to use it, inverting this template and tracing, and just keeping on going and sharing these little pieces of fabric with their friends and making a scrap quilt. Well, we're going to take a little bit bigger approach, as you have heard a little bit earlier in the program, and to work with a tumbler template that is much larger. And this lap quilt features some lovely color combinations and big pieces, and the ends are cut with a template, not just chopped off as they had to do years ago. They would make an uneven sides and then trim away the excess fabric. Well, we can get it exactly to the correct size the first go around. Now you can make your templates bigger. You can make 10, 8, 6-inch templates using your favorite template medium, or there are other options that you can work with, and that includes a template that includes a variety of sizes. So here are some options for sizes: 4, 6, 8, 10. And then if you'd like, you could even make and cut, which we'll be doing, the end pieces, so that you don't have some waste of fabric. On this particular template, all of these shapes are included. It's die cut and colored, so here's 4, 6, 8, and 10. And then there's a little arrow to show that this is the portion of the shape that's used for the end pieces. I'll show you how this works. Now, whether you're using a multiple size template or a traditional just one size only template, you're going to be working in the same manner. So not to fear, this technique will work with any type of template. Now, I have cut these strips 10.5 inches, and I happen to know that that's the length I need for a 10-inch block. On my template, it tells me right there, but you just need to add 1/2-inch seam allowances, 1/4 inch at the top, 1/4 inch at the bottom. Cut fabrics, maybe 2 to 3, perhaps I just have 2 right here, layered one on top of the other, and then do take a little time, and I like to add a spray starch or a spray starch alternative and make those fabrics crisp. It'll make the sewing process so much easier if your fabric is pressed and has that little extra sizing in it. So take some time to work with that. And then I'm going to use the multiple size template and start at the end. So I'm not going to waste any fabric. I'm going to first trace the portion that's going to be an end piece. And I'll line the guideline that shows it at the end. And then with your favorite marking pen or pencil, just trace half of it. Now you can use the full template. Invert it and trace. And invert it and trace. You get the idea. But having it pre-cut the size or the length of the finished block, which would be plus a ½ inch for seam allowances, is a fast way of making this easy to cut. And then grab your ruler, rotary cutter, and mat. I would imagine our predecessors in quilting would have really enjoyed having rotary cutters and mats. Makes things so much faster. And just cut. So you get the idea. You'll be cutting lots and lots of strips and sections. And you have big blocks to work with. Now after making a variety of cuts and all the fabric colors that you would like, then we can do the layout. And the layout works out, I like to do it first. Now if you're really doing a scrappy quilt, you wouldn't have to do this. You could just put a light and a dark strip together. But since we have about 5 different fabric colors, we've done some predetermining to lay this out. And here's row 1. We're starting with an end piece. And lay it out. And then just to make sure you have the right color combination, adding a light next to a dark, mixing up the color shades, mediums, etc. So here we go, and just keep on laying this out. And then the next piece, here we are, here's an end piece. And then the next row, everything is inverted, so it tumbles. What was narrow at the top now is wide at the top. And you can see the pattern that we have going on here, kind of a row on the diagonal. You're going to get that kind of effect. So then after the initial layout, if you like what you see, then simply meet your right sides together. And you could pin, if you'd like, a pin so that the edge is just slightly offset. It's offset about by 1/4 of an inch. It's just a small little amount. And I'm going to grab my pins from underneath my table and show you that you just then pin, maybe 1 pin per piece will be all that you'd need. Then I kind of lay it back to where it was and then add the next piece and then just pin that together, just adding that scant little 1/4 of an inch. After you've pinned 1 row, then go stitch this. And here's a close-up of stitching the seam. Started to stitch right at that little V portion, right where the fabrics overlap, a standard 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Just stitch seam after seam, and soon enough, you'll have rows. Well, we've reset the table, and you can see that we have 2 small rows that have already been stitched, and how nice they look. They're even, they're square, because we have these end pieces. And then look at the pressing. Now this is optional, but at times I like to press, especially these long seams, open rather than closed or to one side, because next step is to sew this seam, the long seam. And because the seams have been pressed open, there's not going to be as much bulk here. The other option is to press the seams to the one side or to the other. The choice is yours. So after a few rows of stitching, you'll have the body of your quilt created. We added some borders, inner border, outer border, binding, but within a few hours of stitching, you'll have a quilt top that's really quite interesting, has the effect of an antique design, but contemporary, using the supersized blocks. Now you're not limited to this design. This is one of my favorites. You'll see it later on in the program of a different style, but it's the hourglass style, where we alternated end to end, wide end to wide end, the various different fabric colorations. And that's kind of an interesting look. And then another design that we did with just 2 colors, very bright, perfect for a teen. Preteen is working with hot pink and a batik. So the batik fabrics work in this manner. So the basic technique of working with a tumbler is very simple. But if you trace various sizes, larger, for example, you can certainly get a speedier process, as well as a quilt that has interest by combining fabrics of light, medium, and dark colors. Stitch a simple sashing strip to one side of each tumbler block to give the quilt added interest. Batik fabrics were chosen for the tumbler blocks in this quilt with a coordinating print for the sashing pieces. It's a refreshing change of color as well as fabric. I would imagine if batik fabrics were available when the initial tumbler designs were brought out, they would have chosen these fabrics as well. We worked with a batik print, and then from that print chose 3 colors that coordinated. We used the hourglass layout, end to end, didn't stagger them, just put them in a row. It's kind of a nice, simple, contemporary look. This tricky part, not that tricky, but the part I'd like to tell you about is adding that sashing strip, because you're going to have to offset the strip just a little bit. But before we get to that part, let's talk about the fabric. You're going to cut a variety of fabrics in the colors, and for this particular quilt we used the 6-inch size. And make certain that from each color, this is the opposite color, but that you cut some end strips. You'll need a few of those. And I have the fabrics stacked to the left of my needle because I'm going to be doing the stitching, getting them convenient. The sashing strip, we just happen to choose 1.5 inches, and I say we because I certainly don't do all the sewing. My staff and I chose 1.5 inches, and you could make this width any width you'd like, but this is the proportion that you see. For setup at your machine, always put in a new needle. This may seem redundant, but I can't stress that enough. With each new project, put in a new needle and use all-purpose sewing thread for your seaming. The foot, you're going to choose a 1/4 inch foot or set your machine so that it's a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I chose a foot that has a single opening. Make sure your machine is set for a straight stitch before you start stitching. And this happens to have a guide bar, so I can easily get an accurate seam allowance. Let me just pop this back on my machine, and then we'll talk about stitching. I'm going to place the sashing strip on the bed of my machine, and notice that I have the machine or the foot about 1 inch from the edge. The inch is the magic number. Because of the angle of the tumbler block, if you sew the blocks end to end, the sashing strip will be short. It'll be short at one end. So we have to allow 1 inch at each between the various strips, and I'll show you what I mean. So I've started approximately 1 inch from the end, but then I don't like to be as approximate. It's better to be assured so that as I reach this end, now instead of starting with the narrow end, I'm going to rotate this and start with the wide end. And you'll see why in a few minutes. And then in addition, I'm going to measure a generous 1 inch between the 2 blocks and then continue the stitching. Now I've ended with the narrow end, and you'll see it coming up, and then just match the narrow end of the beginning of the next row. Measure a generous inch, and after a while you'll be able to eyeball that, and then just keep on stitching. After you've made enough strips, stitch the blocks to the sashing strip, then you're going to do the pressing. And there's one little hint to work with the pressing as well. You're going to press toward the tumbler blocks. Here's the pressing technique, and just press in all the strips in one direction. And then you can see that if you pressed it in the alternate direction, the seam allowance would go in the wrong way, the seam allowance of the strip. So we need that seam allowance of the sashing strip to be flat. So press to that area, and then we can do the layout. After you've done all the pressing, we have to do some cutting. And the cutting will happen working with a rotary cutter and a ruler, and I'll show you that right at the table. After stitching the sashing strip to one side or the other of the tumbling blocks, then it's time for the cutting. Can't stress enough that you have to press the seam allowances toward the block so that when you align the ruler with the edge of the block and you do the cut, you'll have the right width at that end. And then angle the ruler, and you can see now why you need that little extra width. Now probably 1 inch is generous, but I'd rather that you had too much of that little sashing strip than too little. The first time I made this sample, I had too little, so learned from my mistake. And now we'll just finish this first row. So just some simple cutting to get all of the pieces trimmed to size. When I look at these strips and I put the wide end all aligned, you can see that we have the sashing strips alternate lines because we're going to be positioning these end to end, and that's the reason for alternating when sewing the sashing strips together. Earlier, when we made the first tumbling block with that big 10-inch block or shape, it's really not a block, we laid out the rows. And since this has a very specific pattern design, we're going to do the same. Now the end piece, remember you can cut those end pieces right from the design template if you'd like. It's in this area. Let me flip it around so it's correct, but from the dotted line to the edge, you'll be using, I have to get these in the right direction, here we go. You'll be using one end piece without a sashing strip. And then as I lay these out, you'll see what happens. Alternating wide end, short end, and then the opposite end of the end piece does have a sashing strip. So you'll know if you need a sashing strip or not when you lay this out. The following row is everything's inverted. So what started out wide at the top is now narrow. And simple as that. Again, just as a repetition, when we roughly pin these edges together. And when you pin them, you'll just overlap the ends so that there's, I like to call it a little rabbit ear, I think it's commonly called in our industry, just extends above the straight edge. That's approximately 1/4 of an inch. And that's where you'll place a pin or just pin the pieces together roughly. Open it up if you want to. Place the next piece along the edge. Make sure you have just that little extension. Pin the pieces. And you pin the rows together, all the pieces to create a row. Just keep going and then go to your machine and stitch. And pin, and one more. Of course, this is a mini quilt. You would be working with a much larger piece. If you don't do this little preliminary pinning, there's a good chance you'd get the wrong color in a spot. So then this would go to the machine and do the straight stitching of the seams. Do all the same thing for all the rows. And we have some samples of that already completed. And here we go. 1 row, 2 rows, and since this is a sash quilt, we'll add another sashing strip through the middle. So to one of the rows, you're going to simply stitch, and I like to stitch with the seams on the top so that as you're stitching, you can make certain that you're not going to stitch the seams in the wrong direction. After you've stitched the sashing strip to one row, then add the second strip. And you can easily see how this comes to be. You could even vary the widths of the sashing strips. Let's say have one width for the interior and another one for the horizontal strips. There are a lot of options when working with quilts. When we look at the finished design, it's just a very appealing design. Easy to create, made with 6-inch blocks, 1.5-inch strips that have been stashed together. During this program, you've seen that we've worked with very big blocks to small, showing you the traditional tumbler block. 4 inches is about a traditional size. The difference here is that they had to trim the sizes and they had to work with very small pieces. You can get the same effect, interesting tumbler effect, by enlarging the size, making them supersized. This isn't that large, this is only 6 inches, but an 8 or a 10 inches, as you saw examples earlier. A perfect quilting project to use to share with a beginner. If you'd like to teach someone to quilt, this is a great way to start. Fabrics make a huge difference. You can see the contemporary styling makes it wonderful for all age brackets. So the tumbler block, a great way to start learning grandmother's quilting secrets. As sewers and quilters, common terminology is to quarter mark fabric when sewing knits or create quarter scale triangles or even those fat quarters. Quartering is also important when it comes to meal planning. Gail Underbaki, a registered dietitian and coordinator with the University of Wisconsin Health in Madison, Wisconsin, returns again to Sewing with Nancy to give us guidelines when planning meals, helping us to be healthier and more creative people. Gail, in today's program, we supersize the quilt blocks, but that's not what we want to do for nutrition.
Exactly. And then, unfortunately, over the last couple decades, that's exactly what has happened in America.
And, you know, you may think it's a little odd to do nutrition on a sewing and quilting program, but if we don't feel well, we can't be creative.
Exactly.
And
Good eating is a source of energy. It helps you maintain that creative feeling and ability throughout the day, keeps you interested in your projects too.
Now, this is such a striking example because you mentioned that this was a standard dinner plate size, how many years ago?
At least in the early 1900s for sure, and probably up to even 1950.
And then today, this is a standard dinner size
Exactly,
plate.
yes.
So when I serve myself, I kind of like to fill my plate.
Exactly, it looks better when we see
yeah,
it.
of course.
We think it's more food. There's a definite visual aspect to our satisfaction. So if the plate is filled to the edges, we're thinking, oh yeah, that's a lot of food. But on that big plate, the same amount of food is going to look pretty sparse. You put it on the small plate, it's filled up nicely, much more satisfying.
And we talked about quarter marking and fat quarters, quiltings, and this is where the combination or correlation comes to nutrition.
Yes, I think this is a great tool. It's become more common in a lot of dietary guidelines to talk about recommendations for food in terms of cups or servings now, rather than just like a number of ounces of this or that. So here on this plate, as you can see, it's divided into quarters, and one of the quarters is dedicated to protein, which is important to keep us healthy, help us be satisfied and keep our hunger under control. And a quarter is dedicated to some sort of grain or starchy type food, which again is a great source of energy, and if done in moderation like that is just fine. But the key thing I think on this plate is that half of it is filled with vegetables. Vegetables, of course, are lower in calories. We chew more. It takes us longer to eat them. We're more satisfied because we take a longer time with our meal, not to mention the vitamins and minerals.
And it's about the same size as the old-fashioned plate.
Exactly.
And that's maybe what we should go back to, a luncheon plate instead of the supersized dinner plate.
Yes, I think that weight management, that approach by using smaller containers, whether it's the plate or whether it's the bowl of ice cream, instead of a cereal bowl, if you have a dessert bowl, that would also make it look more satisfying.
And you mentioned that many of us struggle with getting enough vegetables, fresh vegetables. And And now we have more conveniences.
Yes, I'm so glad to see that the supermarkets are offering options for people. This is an example of many different things that are in the stores now. They come in packaged servings that would be appropriate for a meal. So if you took a sandwich to work, for example, plus you had a container of frozen vegetables like this, you've got your plate filled exactly in the right proportions.
So half square triangle, we have a half square of or half plate of vegetables.
Yes.
And now we can also add some color.
Right, yes. This salad mix, of course, it's a lot of different colored lettuces and other sorts of greens. So the nutrients are a variety of nutrients in the salad. And it looks prettier, so it's going to be more fun.
Yeah, like a quilt, lights, mediums, and dark colors. Light, medium, and dark vegetables.
Right.
It's satisfying to the eye.
And it's convenient. Both of these items, I think it doesn't take a lot of time. You just have to have it on hand in the house and you're ready to go.
Now, we all like a little dessert.
Oh, certainly. Yes, yes.
I have to say, oh boy, that's my weakness.
And you might have noticed there wasn't a fruit on that plate. But fruit makes great dessert or snacks. It's high in fiber. It's nice and sweet. So sometimes it takes the place of dessert. Or in this particular case, I've included a little chocolate here because...
And dark chocolate.
Dark chocolate is more healthy than the milk chocolate, and it's delicious.
And we need healthy fats.
Yes, we do. Yes, they're satisfying. They help us keep the rest of our food intake under control. So this is an example. Olive oil is one. Other liquid vegetable oils would also be. This is an avocado. Could be used in a salad or make a dip and use it with crackers. So lots of options.
Well, Gail, thank you for joining us. And I think we've gotten it in our minds that we shouldn't supersize our meal planning, just our quilt blocks.
Exactly.
Scale down those plates, and if you'd like more information on this segment, you can go to www.nancyzieman.com, and you'll find links to my Nancy's Corner guests, such as Gail, and you'll also be able to watch current Sewing with Nancy programs online and read my blog. Basically, you'll find everything related to Sewing with Nancy at that site. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.
Nancy has written instructions and designed templates that can be used to create the quilts featured in this series. They're $19.99 plus shipping and handling. To order this reference material, call 800-336-8373 or visit our website at sewingwithnancy.com/2506. Order item number CL9525, Grandmother's One Patch Quilts Templates. Credit card orders only. To pay by check or money order, call the number on the screen for details. Visit Nancy's website at nancyzieman.com to see additional episodes, Nancy's blog, and more. Sewing with Nancy, TV's longest-airing sewing and quilting program with Nancy Zieman, has been brought to you by Baby Lock, Madeira Threads, Koala Studios, Clover, Amazing Designs, and Class A Needles. Closed captioning funding provided by Rowenta. Sewing with Nancy is a co-production of Nancy Zieman Productions and Wisconsin Public Television.